Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this session this afternoon as part of our Global Forum on Forest Governance. My name is Allson Hoare. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, and it's my pleasure to be chairing the session this afternoon. Before we turn to the substance of our discussions, I wanted to run through a few practical logistical issues. Firstly, I'm very pleased to let you know that we have interpretation facilities available in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Indonesian. So if you would, well, whichever language you would like to listen to, you need to select that language. At the bottom of your screen, there's a small globe icon and you can select your language there. I would also like to highlight that this session is on the record. We are recording the session and we will be making it available online afterwards so that more people will be able to hear the discussions. And finally, just on the format, so we will be hearing presentations from the speakers to begin with, and then there will be an opportunity for you to submit your questions. So please, as you listen to the speakers and the discussion, please do put your questions into the chat, and then there will be opportunity at the end to hear the speaker's response to those. I will, if we have time, I will ask people to read out their questions. If you would rather not and you would like me to read them on your behalf, it would be useful if you could just flag that in the chat when you write your question. Okay, I think those are all the logistical issues. So this is the final session of our global forum, and a key theme that has come out over the last 2 days of our discussion is the importance of ensuring that all stakeholders are not just consulted but also have a voice in actually shaping the decision making and how forests are actually managed and governed. And this is essential not just for equity and justice, but also to help develop solutions and ways forward that are practical and effective. So this is a key underlying theme of this discussion on lawmaking. So we will be considering what is needed to ensure effective and real participation in lawmaking. But we'll also be reflecting on what can be learned from some of the recent legal reforms that have been seen, in which social and environmental protections have been rolled back in a number of countries as they seek to prioritize economic growth. So we have 5 excellent speakers lined up, looking forward to hearing from them. The running order will be, first of all, we'll be hearing from Tanja Venisnik, then turning to Ines Mvukani. Our third speaker will be Ketty Marcelo Lopez, and then Cathal Doyle, and finally Rukka Sombolinggi. So our first speaker, I will just give a quick introduction before handing over the microphone. Tanja works with the environmental NGO Client Earth and is based here in the UK. And Tanja leads their climate and forests team and leads their work on providing legal support to community forestry processes in Africa and Southeast Asia. And she's trained as a lawyer in Slovenia and also in the UK. Tanja, over to you.
Thank you, Allison, and hello to everybody. I would like to base my few remarks, introductory remarks, on some of the learnings that Client Earth had with the work on legal reforms in West and Central Africa, as well as on some research conducted in Southeast Asia around these issues. Our forest and climate team has been working in West and Central Africa for roughly 10 years now. So hopefully we are now able to kind of shine a light on some of the kind of positive issues that we've encountered with the ongoing legal reforms in those countries. So basically, we often say that good legal reforms are a critical first step in the process of making real and long-lasting change. And obviously, there are many elements that make up a good legal reform process. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to highlight two. We first need to understand that lawmaking requires an iterative approach. So legal reforms are not a linear process. And in our work, we found that to be truly participatory, the reform methodology needs not only to be bottom-up and flexible, but also iterative, allowing laws to be revised periodically, ensuring that they are fit for purpose, that they really reflect the changes in practice and in society and needs of local communities and indigenous peoples who live in forested areas. And in terms of this, Nepal's action learning approach really comes to mind, where Nepal fine-tuned their community forestry legal framework for a number of years, if not decades, and applied a very deliberative and iterative approach. And that basically created a very robust and enabling legal framework that in turn gave birth for one of the most advanced models of community forestry in the region. The second key thing I'd like to highlight is obviously participation and the necessity to make a case for meaningful and effective participation of all stakeholders. Why? Because this allows stakeholders to take better ownership of the process, and so that the regulation that's adopted is consensual and equitable. And also because of implementation, people may not be willing to follow laws they don't understand or haven't been consulted on. And this then can lead to many amendments of the laws, which require further technical, financial, and human resources, which is obviously not the best use of those resources. And obviously, this is all good on paper, but in practice, how do we ensure effective participation? It does start with transparency. So participants, so stakeholders need to be informed about the law and have access to legal information in order to really be able to participate. And here the importance of legal trainings and demystifying the law for non-lawyer audiences is crucial. And I think Ines in her presentation will touch on those experiences in the Republic of Congo as well. Another key element would be continuous participation. It's very important to involve stakeholders from the get-go. So not just to invite them for some, national level validation of a certain draft law, but make sure that everybody is involved in the development of the legal reform methodology of that roadmap from the get-go. We've also, in our work, have seen that it is absolutely crucial to share the information with stakeholders in a timely manner and allow enough time for stakeholders to prepare contributions and their amendments to certain basically drafts of laws or other legal texts that are being prepared. And this is often a challenge that we've observed in ongoing legal reform processes. Also, consultations also need to involve populations who actually directly depend on forests for their lives and livelihoods. And we always encourage that consultation processes take place on national and local levels, and that they include not just civil society organizations, but local communities and indigenous peoples as well. And finally, maybe it's very important to respect the rules of the game and not to unilaterally change the rules of stakeholder consultation processes once they've been established as well. So for example, once validated by all stakeholders, the texts that are undergoing revision should not undergo further modifications without renewing the consultation process. Obviously, we encounter many challenges in these processes, and we are often asked why legal reforms take so long and why are they so difficult to achieve. And I think it's because they are a process, and as such, they really require meticulous planning, coordination, and consultation, and especially effective consultation takes a long time. But we can also observe, for example, in the example of Ghana that recently adopted their timber resources management legality licensing regulation, or the legislative instrument, that instrument was adopted in record time due to the fact that stakeholders have been really actively involved from the get-go and in all stages of the process. So here, this broad participation didn't make the process slower, but it actually sped up the process as well. And then maybe finally, I would like to emphasize that forest governance processes, especially the FLEGT VPA process, and maybe more recently, the CAFI process opened a door to participatory legal reform processes in many countries by making them in a way mandatory. However, we also observed that where is no such incentive, there is a temptation to quickly revert to business as usual. So that means that then laws are being drafted or revised behind closed doors, and civil society organizations are invited to take part only once they find out about the process and raise alarm. So I'd say that there's still a way to go before participatory deliberative approaches are fully internalized by decision makers. And this is exactly why processes such as the VPA and CAFI are so important, playing a key role in ensuring legal reforms are participatory. And finally, crisis situations such as the COVID pandemic have caused a rollback on safeguards and have negatively impacted particularly on civil society ability to participate in different forest governance processes, not just on national level, but on international level as well. But I'll leave this to our other panelists to zoom in on more during their presentations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanja. A really good opening presentation for this discussion, and some great points that we will revert back to in the discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to move directly to our next speaker. Gary Ines Mbukani is a legal expert with the civil society organization Comptoir Juridique Junior in the Republic of Congo. And she also works as an associate with Client Earth. In her work, she focuses on gender, human rights, and natural resources, and she has been very closely involved in the process of reform of Congo's forest code. And Ines will be sharing reflections on that process. I would also like to flag that we feature Ines as the what's the word? She's featured in our latest Forest Voices story that we have just published on our forest governance website. And we'll post the link to that in our chat. And that piece also focuses on this process of legal reform. Okay, Ines, over to you.
Merci, Allison.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for giving me the floor and inviting me to this session. We'll talk straight away about reform in the process that started in 2012 in the Republic of Congo. And for almost 8 years, it lasted almost 8 years, and it led to the VPA signature. And we wanted to add additional legislation to this. This process meant that we could draft one text, and this process meant that we could take into account local communities' rights and the duty in terms of sustainable land use. And we are trying to focus on climate change and to protect our forests. Throughout this process, we have reinforced exchanges with administrations, and we regularly informed them of the process, and we had an implementation schedule. We made sure that all of the stakeholders were involved, and that was done in a transparent way. People in charge of the process showed the goodwill of all of the stakeholders and showed that all of the questions were answered positively and reactively. The stakeholders normally must favor consensus in order to make progress on the collaborative work, despite the different disagreements. This also means that we can reinforce advocacy to take into account various comments and remarks, including when people disagree with the formulation. It is always important to have some people doing a follow-up of the process. However, we need to communicate that to all of the stakeholders, and this is why in our country we used parliament members, and we managed to influence the contributions at the parliament level, and this meant that we can take into account 60% of civil society's contributions. This also meant that members of the parliament who adopted this law, could really understand the concepts used regarding sustainable forest management. And to make sure that some interventions were more efficient, it's important for civil society to be involved. And in the Congo, civil society organized and mobilized itself and developed an intervention strategy that meant that we could set up expertise from civil society within a legal working group in order to be able to bring their own contribution and analyze various contributions and interventions which had been done and were then validated by the stakeholders and integrated in the forest law that was published.
At the same time, it is important to take into consideration the communities that live around and in the forests. And in the Republic of Congo, civil society, what civil society did, it organized consultation sessions and identification sessions to identify these local communities and indigenous peoples. It also managed to identify the different needs of each of these communities and to translate these needs into priorities and then into rights. And those rights were then introduced. This process can only be effective if the other stakeholders are around the table and if the stakeholders work together. If the different stakeholders come together and uphold what is essential to move towards sustainable forest management. This is what was done in the Republic of Congo. We sat around a table, we looked at the forest reform, and we looked at its revision. Congo made it possible for all stakeholders to be involved and for all of the stakeholders to find a consensus, and that consensus is reflected in the forest law that was published in 2020. A participatory consensus, a collaboration must be one of the essential elements of a reform to make it possible for each stakeholder to take ownership of the law and favor a sustainable management of forests. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ines. And yeah, really interesting that you highlight the need for collaboration and compromise, I think, as well on occasion in order to find ways forward. Again, we will return to these issues in the discussion. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have questions that come to you during these initial presentations, please do post these in the Q&A. So our third speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Ketty Marcelo Lopez. Ketty is a leader and activist in Peru, where she has been working to defend the rights of Indigenous peoples, and in particular of Indigenous women. She's currently the national coordinator for the organization OMUSIC, which is the Organization of Indigenous Ashaninka Women of the Central Amazon, and that works to promote the exercise and defense of the rights of Indigenous women of Peru at both the national and international level. Ketty.
Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's important to hear the voices of those of us who live and defend our lands. As has been said, I represent the organization of Ashaninka Amazonian Indigenous Women of Peru. I'm also Ashanican from the central Peruvian jungle. Indigenous people in Peru come from a process, a historic process of fighting and resistance. What we have up till now, we have found it hard to obtain. Nothing has been given to us. However, our fight is defending our lands. Often we are called environmental defenders, but we don't just defend the forests. We also defend life in order to guarantee the historic continuity of our peoples. Because Indigenous people in Peru and in Latin America in general, without our lands, we would not really exist. Our land is our pharmacy where we find our medicines. It's our supermarket where we find our foods. It's the place where we also find the accessories to make our houses. It means everything to us, even more so the rivers. Throughout the years, our fight has been non-stop, especially so that the laws, the Western laws, are consistent with our vision as Indigenous people. We look at the land in an integral way. We do not separate forests from water and whoever lives there. However, the Peruvian state promulgates law which separates water resources, the Water Resources Act, the Forest Resources Act, the Climate Change Act, and the Indigenous Communities or Lands Law. However, our vision as Indigenous peoples is all-encompassing. When we go to our lands, they're all there. In the last 30 years, the political constitution of the Peruvian state has taken away our lands. Before this constitution of 1993, our indigenous lands were sacred. Nobody could access them, and they were forever, and also impossible to seize. However, the 1993 constitution, it removes this sacred, and it's not forever either. We just have the capacity for it not to be seized. This has also been one of the long fights as indigenous people to fight to change this constitution so that we can carry on guaranteeing our lands. We have also seen with a lot of concern that the state promulgates laws which removes us from our lands. It's not just what they call environmental pacts. It is a system to remove the lands so that the native and peasant communities to be removed, which is where indigenous peoples live. Even though it's true that for those laws to be promulgated, that for the previous consultation, a massacre was needed. Some indigenous peoples died, as well as people from the army. However, the prior consultation law is not consistent with the Convention 169, as well as other international conventions which provide us rights as indigenous people. Throughout these years, consultation processes have taken place, like in the forestry law that we were able to participate in order to contribute from our vision and to propose the guaranteeing of the tenure of our lands. And more recently, in 2018, the climate change law was also promulgated, and we have had the chance to participate in the regulation of this law regarding climate change. And as an organization, and an indigenous organization, we are proposing the Mother Nature law that gives rights to Mother Nature, what we call Pachamama. It's very difficult for us to persuade parliamentarians because they say Mother Nature is not a living being, so how come it would have rights? You cannot give rights to rivers and forests. It's like a paradigm change. However, for us, from the beginning of times, we've learned to consider the rivers and everything that we're surrounded by as part of our family. When a river is polluted, it's as if you saw a brother dying, and that hurts when a relative dies. That's what happens when we see forests being burned or when rivers die. This is why from our organization, we're also fighting, highlighting for the need to pass this law on Mother Nature. In other countries, such as Bolivia and Ecuador, this has already been done. However, for us, this seems to be a challenge because those who don't consider themselves indigenous people do not share our vision, our integral view, which we have. This is as if you were living in two parallel worlds. This fight is also what we have inherited from our ancestors. If we don't fight for our lands and our forests, we will not be able to guarantee our historic continuity. We don't want Indigenous people to be admired and looked at in museums. We are living cultures, so we should also have rights more away from this exotic and folkloric nature. We are also living beings. We have children, that they have the right to education, the right to health. This is the fight that we have as people. And also, little by little, we have been participating. And with the new president that will come to power, what we're looking for is the change to this constitution so that we can go back to having those rights to keeping our lands forever. This is what I wanted to share with you, our fight as peoples and as Indigenous women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ketty, for that powerful presentation, and yeah, a very good reminder of the critical importance of these issues that we're discussing here. I will turn now to our fourth speaker. Cathal Doyle is a lecturer at Middlesex University here in the UK, where he specialises in the rights of Indigenous peoples under international and national law and the interface with business and human rights and sustainable development. Cathal, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Allson, and hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us. And yes, as Ketty has explained, Indigenous peoples have been involved in long struggles for reforms that would align national laws with their perspectives on their lands, territories, and resources. And they've also participated very effectively in international processes that have led to significant developments in international standards on their rights. And some of this progress has in turn been reflected in domestic legal and policy frameworks, notably, for example, the constitutional provisions in Brazil and Colombia in relation to participation and land rights. But that said, there's a constant struggle to maintain these hard fought for gains, given the very deeply embedded structural discrimination that's reflected in laws and practices, in particular in sectors such as mining, forestry, and conservation. And with the onset of the pandemic, Indigenous peoples started to report an acceleration in government plans and initiatives to weaken the existing safeguards for their rights. And Forest Peoples Programme, an NGO that works in collaboration with Indigenous peoples in partnership with Yale and Middlesex universities, and researchers in the 5 world's most tropically forested countries, that's Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and the DRC, did an analysis of the extent to which this rollback of safeguards was happening in the context of the pandemic. And the research really revealed a stark attempt to roll back social and environmental safeguards in the name of economic recovery and continuity. And this was reflected very strongly in an acceleration of large-scale energy mining and agribusiness activities in Indigenous lands, but also land grabbing for illegal deforestation activities in those territories. And alarmingly, it was also reflected in changes in laws and policies and regulations that actually legalize this land grabbing of forested areas and eliminate existing safeguards and weaken institutions and mechanisms that were there to oversee those safeguards. And all of this coupled with an increase in the already very disturbing level of criminalization and violence and prosecution of Indigenous representatives. So in addition to highlighting this kind of expansion of the systematic violation of Indigenous people's rights, the research highlighted the vulnerability of legal reforms in a context such as the pandemic and the efforts after the pandemic or during the pandemic to have economic recovery. And this is particularly clear in the area of laws around consultation, participation, and consent in relation to decisions that impact directly on Indigenous people's rights. And while we see some promising examples of participation around the development of legislation or regulation in relation to consultation, such as in Costa Rica in 2018 with the development of a consultation mechanism with the consent of Indigenous peoples, this is very much an exception. And where there are developments, they're often subject to subsequent manipulation or weakening. And the law on prior consultation, which Ketty mentioned in Peru, is one example of this, as its implementation has been very strongly criticized by Indigenous peoples as failing to protect their rights, which should be the purpose and objective of a law on consultation, and instead acting as something that's merely a sort of rubber stamping of predetermined state decisions. And what we saw during the pandemic was this situation actually deteriorated, with governments, including the governments of Colombia, of Brazil, and Peru, attempting to impose virtual online consultation processes on Indigenous communities. And these attempts were strongly rejected by Indigenous peoples as being completely at odds with their own customary decision-making practices and their own self-determination-based consultation and consent protocols and laws. So then that sort of raises the question, well, what needs to be done? And faced with this effort to roll back safeguards for their rights, Indigenous peoples have responded and continue to respond through various self-assertions of self-determination and autonomy. This is reflected in the forming of autonomous governments, in the self-demarcation of territories, and notably in the context of participatory rights in the development of their own autonomous consultation and consent protocols and laws. And the importance of respecting these autonomous assertions of decision-making rights in the form of protocols or laws is recognized in some decisions of courts in Brazil and Colombia and by some government agencies in Brazil. But really, for effective implementation, we need the support of international organizations, of donor governments, and of corporations to ensure that the gains that Indigenous peoples have made at the international level, and in some cases at the national level, really translate into sustainable realities on the ground. And specifically, the report that I mentioned, developed by Forest Peoples Programme, calls on consumer governments to use their influence on governments in tropically forested countries to ensure the effective participation of Indigenous peoples in any pandemic recovery activities and in the monitoring of any environmental and human rights harms. It also calls on international financial institutions and aid organizations to develop strategies in conjunction with Indigenous peoples that aim to prevent rights violations and directly support Indigenous peoples to strengthen their own autonomy and territorial control in the context of any post-COVID-19 recovery interventions. And lastly, it calls on multinational corporations, international financial institutions, and conservation organizations to implement due diligence in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the conclusion, and one of the key arguments, that these steps are necessary to protect Indigenous people's rights and to ensure their survival as peoples, but they're also essential, as research has repeatedly shown, to ensure the effective protection of our forests, of biodiversity, and to mitigate climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathal, for your comments. Also hugely interesting and thought-provoking, and raises the question of what can be done to try and ensure that any gains are resilient and robust to economic and political pressures. So an issue again that I'm sure we will return to. So our final speaker is Rukka Sombolinggi. She is the Secretary General of the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, Aman, in Indonesia. Rukka is trained in agriculture and also in political science, I think, and she has been working with Aman for over 20 years, advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples in Indonesia and beyond. Rukka, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. My presentations will talk around the current situations now, especially during this difficult time for all of us, and very much relevant with the report that has been that was just presented by Cathal earlier. So the remoteness of indigenous locations and lack of access to state health services, making indigenous peoples among the most vulnerable to COVID-19, especially those without secure tenure, and particularly those whose land have been seized and forced to live as oil palm farmers, mining farmers, are among the most threatened because of interconnection to global supply chain, and also at the same time the lack of state health care and services. In the time of COVID-19, since March last year, 2020, indigenous peoples across Indonesia have undertaken various initiatives to help the government minimizing harm and strengthening our resilience, including indigenous rituals, independent quarantine, ensuring food reserve, and also producing herbal medicines. So that's our contributions during these difficult situations. However, on the other side, the contributions of indigenous peoples remain ignored continuously by the government. The situations pictured in some discriminative regulations and law, including the revisions of law and mineral and coal mining, and also the adoptions of indigenous omnibus law on job creations. And a year earlier, before last year, the parliament also adopted a law on anti-corruption eradications, on anti-corruption commissions, which actually weakened the efforts to fight the corruptions itself. At the same time, the law on indigenous peoples remain a bill again after 10 decades, after 10 years. This we call it rollback last year, has impacted to the indigenous peoples remaining territories, and also creating a big wave of oppositions from the civil society, including from indigenous peoples. It's truly nothing about us without us, because a robust legal framework, as we're talking about progress, is possible only if government include indigenous peoples in all decision-making processes, especially with regards to indigenous peoples. Full and effective participation means being present, heard, and be part of the decision makers. This is the only way government will be able to reflect on the real situations and translates those into progressive legal frameworks. The bill on indigenous peoples that has been sitting for more than 10 years in the parliament is critical to protect indigenous peoples and allowing us to contribute to the protections and healing our Mother Earth and humanity in the most effective way. I wanted to add a little bit to participations, as mentioned also by Cathal earlier. During this pandemic, because we are all on lockdown, the government and forced to adopt the law on job creations without participations from Indigenous peoples at all. And they only have a few occasions online and on YouTube, and there's no way we can participate, especially for Indigenous peoples who don't have access to communications. So the full and effective participation should happen in all levels, at local levels, at national level, and also at international level, such as COP26 that is coming very soon at the end of this year in Glasgow. And in addition to providing direct support from donors to Indigenous peoples and financial institutions, they also have to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, including full compliance with free, prior, informed consent in any development projects. But to this day, violations of Indigenous human rights continue to take place in Indonesia and across the globe. The climate crisis is worsening, and the coronavirus is taking its toll on our wrongdoing in the past, and we continue to do to our Mother Earth and humanity. We all have the obligations, all of us here, all of us, the citizens of the world, have the obligations to stop this catastrophe. What the message I heard from our Indigenous elders is coronavirus, this pandemic, might not be the last one. If we continue to treat our Mother Earth, to treat other human beings the way we do it now, this coronavirus will certainly not be the last one, but it is only will unfold the many more crises, many more pandemics, many more catastrophe in the future. So that's the message that we heard from our Indigenous elders. And I'm convinced that we all can, but only if we all take actions and works together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rukka, also for another very powerful and thought-provoking presentation. So we now have the opportunity for a bit of a discussion. I would remind everybody, if you do have questions, please do post them in the Q&A. Also to the panelists, if you would like to put any questions to your co-panelists, please do post them in the chat as well, or raise your hand and we can take questions that way too. To get things going, I mean, what we've heard is it's almost two distinct narratives of, we started hearing from Tanja and Ines about some of the potential of more participatory and inclusive processes. And there was, hearing of the case in Congo of what can be achieved when everyone is willing and able to sit down and to collaborate and to thrash out ways forward. And then on the flip side, we've been hearing about really the very limited extent to which such processes are actually being implemented on the ground and are being used. And so it raises for me the question of how we can get beyond either the promising starts and how we can scale up and ensure that these more inclusive approaches become the norm rather than the exception. Perhaps just to start, wanted to return to you, Ketty, and you mentioned that there had been some positive examples of, you referred to the fact that there had been participation of Indigenous peoples in the forestry law and in the climate change law. I would be interested in hearing what made a difference. So what were the incentives maybe for the government to open up the process? What was it that led to that process being more open?
Sí, en el año...
Yes. In around 2009, Alan Garcia's government, who was the president that called the indigenous people citizens, second-class citizens, there was a massacre. And before these, for around 14 years, we had the 169 agreement, and it had not been regulated, any kind of law or regulation for prior consultation. During this massacre, some indigenous people and military people died. And it was from this that the parliament decided to present this prior consultation law. And this was a law that wasn't aligned with this 169, with this agreement 169. However, the indigenous peoples hoped that with this law, we would be respected. At least we would be taken into account and consulted. So it was in this way that in 2011, the law was signed, and in 2012, the indigenous peoples began to take part in the consultation processes in our country. During the first process in which we took part, this was the one around the normalizing this law. And in Peru, we have 55 indigenous peoples, indigenous groups, and the representatives of different indigenous organizations were able to participate. And about 50 or 60% of our suggestions were taken into account. Later on, there was the law of intercultural health, and we also participated in this, but this law was not enacted. Then the forest and wildlife law, we also took part in this process. There was wide participation, in fact, because we have always requested for our right to participate to be respected. If they're going to try to impose rules and regulations on the forest that we have protected for many, many years, we had to be part of these conversations. And we took part in this process of the forest and wildlife law. And we propose that the forests should be respected, that the river basins were respected, biodiversity was respected, that when roads were being built through a forest, that there was a consultation process with the indigenous peoples, because in many occasions we say, well, people say, yes, building roads means development, but then it also opens the doors to land grabbing, to drug trafficking, illegal logging. So these are proposals that don't seem to understand, or the state doesn't seem to understand our perspective. They want to build roads, and then we're just left behind. So we have put, say, padlocks on these laws, and something similar happened with the law on climate change. We presented some proposals, and from that, we started working on the Indigenous Climate Platform, which is being created, and Indigenous peoples are participating in this, but in a more general way, from 2011 onwards, Indigenous peoples have access to spaces in different sectors, and these are health, education, the Ministry for Women, the Environment Ministry. The spaces for participation are there, but we still don't have the power to make decisions. These are working groups where Indigenous peoples can present suggestions, which sometimes are taken into account and other times are ignored. So we're still fighting in order to take part in other national commissions, for example, the Climate Change Commission. And it would be very important for us to take part in this. And we have fought hard so that the Indigenous participation is reflected in the law. But up to now, they see us as civil society, and they're not opening the spaces for us. But we're still there fighting to ensure our participation in several spaces.
Thank you, Ketty. One issue that came out of the presentations is the fact that some international agreements, such as the VPAs, have helped to create an environment or some incentives for the government to open up legal processes to more stakeholders. I'd be interested in hearing, this is a question to all of the panelists, of what they think could be done by the international community where they don't have those kinds of agreements in place. What else do you think the international community should be doing to try and encourage your governments and other governments to adopt these types of approach? Who would like to respond? Any takers? Rukka, yes.
Sorry, I'm still used to manual raising my hand. Thank you very much. I think the terms encourage is really not adequate now. Yeah, there should be a encourage voluntary. I think it's not gonna work for us because we already have existing agreements, existing mechanisms that is based on voluntary based, and they are not working. Yeah, and I can guarantee you that we have used some of that platform, some of that mechanisms, and they fail us as Indigenous peoples. Why? Because the government will always find their way, even if, and especially when you speak about legality, that is even much more easier for them to get away with legality. And I can promise you, most of the produce from Indonesia that people in Europe or in America or in China, in India is consuming, that is coming from Indonesia, they might be legal, but they are at the expense of the blood of Indigenous peoples. So when you're running your cars using oil palm from Indonesia for biodiesel, you are actually fuming your cars using our blood. And that is the reality that is still going on now in Indonesia. So I think, and why is this happen? Because when decisions are made, we were not there, and also is made, those were made without considering how can we participate in ensuring those agreement taking place on the ground, and how can the agreement reflect our situations as Indigenous peoples, and most importantly, how can those arguments will really reflect our needs and our aspirations and protect our rights as Indigenous peoples. So I think that's my general comment on the situations with all these legally or non-legally binding agreements that is available now. What is needed now? It's the law that will legally binding for all the government to follow, and will ensure indigenous peoples to participate, and also in monitoring and evaluation of all of the produce that is going out of Indonesia. Because I think that is the problem for us, because others in different continents need to eat something from us, need to use something from us, and that's all that matters. So, and I also call for the citizens, yeah, the consumers. This is not our responsibility from indigenous peoples only to convince everybody. You also need to change yourself. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rukka. Yes, I see Cathal has his hand raised. I will turn to you, Cathal.
Yeah, I just quickly add, to echo what Rukka said. I think that there is the potential to influence the supply chains for forest commodities. We are the markets for those commodities, and there's an interesting example just in a bill that's before the House of Lords in the UK, the UK Environmental Act, where there's a proposal to include a requirement for Indigenous people's consent, to ensure that consent has been obtained for any forest produce that are being sold in the UK. But it needs to go further than that. It needs to look at the rights, the respect for rights. And that then comes back to Rukka's comment that the only way we can really ensure that is that the monitoring goes back to the communities, and that there's some forms of checks on agreements that are actually entered into with communities, and that are continued to be sustained and have the support of communities. And this is where the investor community comes in, as well as governments. It can't be one actor alone. And maybe just going back to the point that law is not enough. Law is very important, but it's not adequate, and we see that with laws being weakened. So participation in the development of law and effective participation is key. But on the other hand, respect for Indigenous people's autonomy and support for that is the other pillar that is absolutely essential. It has to go hand in hand with ensuring that these laws are meaningful.
Thank you, Cathal. I see Ketty and Tanja both have their hands up. So we'll turn firstly to Tanja.
Thanks, Allson. Yeah, just quickly again to echo what Rukka and Cathal were saying. Also on the EU level, a forest risk commodities regulation is underway, and hopefully its main mechanism will be a due diligence mechanism, basically mandatory due diligence that is human rights based, and where FPIC is, a main key principle. And also, making clear that C in FPIC stands for consent, not consultation. We see this time and time again, how these things get misinterpreted a lot, intentionally or unintentionally. So yeah, voluntary schemes are not enough. They have proven not to work, and really need robust binding legal frameworks to regulate this.
Thank you, Tanja. And Ketty.
La palabra. I'd like to share. I do share what Rukka has mentioned. With regards to the participation of peoples, we are not present in the creation of some policies, then our thoughts and our ideas and proposals will not be taken into account. With regards to international community, I talked about the massacre of 2009, because the government was passing laws that were taking our lands away from us, and the state had to eliminate these laws under the pressure of the international community. What's happening in Peru? Peruvians are killing each other, indigenous people against the military, but there was pressure from the international community. In the last few years, Peru has had to go to the United Nations to explain how the guarantee of indigenous people's rights are being taken. However, the consent issues not being complied with. It's just consultation. And we feel during these years that prior consultation has become another box ticking exercise. However, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have the rights. So I think this still has to be worked on. There is also a space which is called human rights work plan with companies, and is also promoted by the United States. This is where indigenous peoples are also participating. So there are different spaces where the international community is participating.
Thank you, Ketty. And I'll turn to Ines, and then I will turn to some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. But Ines, you wanted to respond.
Yes. What I have to say is pretty much in the same vein as the other speakers. One of the fundamental elements will be ensuring that we have stricter laws at the international level. We need more binding laws. This will make it possible for local communities and indigenous peoples to be involved. It is true that there are efforts that are being made. In Congo, for example, with the new forest law, the FPIC aspect has been embedded, free, prior, informed consent. This is progress, which means that now the communities must be consulted on a number of issues. Is this sufficient, though? At the international level, rules must be made to ensure that laws are enforced. And this will allow for a stricter management of forest activities and will allow communities to be involved in decision making. This is a fundamental element. Only due to this and only with this will we manage to guarantee everyone's participation. But for this, we need unprecedented efforts, and we need to make further efforts that will make sustainable forest management more strict.
Thank you, Ines. Okay, I'm going to turn now to some of the questions. I wanted to ask Arthur Hoare to say a little bit about what has been happening in northern Uganda. I hope that he is able to speak if he can be hooked up. He mentions that the proposed Mother Nature law is similar to interventions in northern Uganda. I was hoping he could elaborate a little bit on that. If Arthur is there. No. Okay, if not, I'm going to move on to another question. One issue that has come up in particular with the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, is we have shifted to online platforms and online consultations and so forth. And this was mentioned as there's clearly a risk there of excluding a lot of people that don't have access to technology to participate through these routes. So a question for me is, if there's ways in which technology and online participation actually could be a tool that could improve participation by Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. So that's my question. And also wanted to call on Peter Tibber to ask his question, which relates to this as well. Peter, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks very much for calling my question. I was struck by the Cathal's reference to it being difficult for Indigenous groups to use Zoom. None of us like it. It's only a small point, but it leads to, which is that, of course, it's extremely important that the rights and lands of Indigenous peoples are properly protected and that they are properly consulted on any changes. I think that's absolutely essential, clearly, for the communities themselves and for all of us, for the protection of the environment. But I just wondered, I'd be particularly interested what the Indigenous representatives themselves think about what is the need, or is there a need for Indigenous communities to adjust and adapt to the modern world and to the modernization of their own countries, and if so, how they should do that. Thank you.
Rukka, would you like to respond first, and then perhaps Cathal?
Yeah, I think we all agree that all of us, we all social organisms, whoever we are, and our cultures are very dynamic, and that's including Indigenous peoples, also including how what so-called in the theory of modernization, what so-called moving from traditional society into modern society. It's also that we are all dynamics, and also that's the same things with Indigenous peoples. We are not freeze in time, yeah, and I think it's not reflects the reality of Indigenous peoples if we portray Indigenous peoples as unwilling to change. Yeah, unwilling to change. But we always change, and we are very up to date. We are very relevant to the current situations, and the proof, as I mentioned, from Indonesia, who are the most safest place under the sky now during this crisis is Indigenous territory, who still have intact ecosystem. Yeah. The unsafe is all the things that is what so-called already destroyed by what so-called modernity, including the city. Here now, like where I live now, it's like hell now. We all want to go home now, including me, to my homeland. So, and when we speak about willing to change, we are, and we force ourselves. But that's also to respond to the oppressions and discrimination that we have faced. But let me tell you one example of how we can use technology. Indigenous peoples movement, we have used technology a lot. We use the GIS technology to allow us to communicate ourselves, our territory, our boundaries to people outside us who don't understand our language. That is what people know as Indigenous map. Indigenous map is not our concept. It is alien concept to us. We don't need map. But people outside, government and company and scholars, yeah, the what so-called smart people in the university, they cannot understand our concept of territory, our concept of existence. They only can understand if we put dots on paper. And we use technology for that. Zoom, for example, in Amman now, because of our situations, we force ourselves. Now we can have national meetings. National meetings, we can have 700 equipments connected to get all of our leaders from across Indonesia. And that happens 3 days back on the 10th of July to organize how do we respond to the situations because our government is not working. But those are all because we just have to. Yeah, we just have to. I don't hate to sit on Zoom. We already have my office now, Indigenous Organizations Office, fully online. We call Aman online every day. Why? Because we need to protect ourselves. But when we speak about talking about our rights, negotiating about the law that will impact us, we cannot simplify that. Oh, because you already have Zoom now, then come on, we can have Zoom. It's another issue that we need to discuss. Full and meaningful, full and effective participation also means in our own terms, including our timelines. We cannot be also forced to make sure that we will have to decide on something in the matter of a year if we cannot. And that's why free prior informed consent is very important. And that's why also government and companies doesn't like free prior informed consent, because they say it's expensive and take long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to respond to this point? Yes, Cathal.
Yeah, just maybe I think an important thing to clarify is that the point about the attempt to impose online or virtual consultations is something very different from a community, using Zoom. It's something worlds apart. So to set the context, the Inter-American Commission, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, said at the outset of the pandemic, there should not be consultations in relation to large-scale developments in Indigenous lands during this period. They should freeze that process. So this was an effort to get around the respect for rights. So that's maybe the starting point. But then I think the points that Rukka make are key. So the whole notion of consultation and consent, it's a self-determination based right. It's a process that Indigenous peoples should be defining how they're going to engage in that process. And to expect them to move to doing that online without having a chance to work together to figure out how that should happen is just not realistic. I mean, it takes years for communities to come together to develop their own procedures and laws around this, because these are decisions that affect their survival as people. So it's something so existential that the disingenuity of governments to say we're going to move to an online consultation was farcical. And so it's a very interesting question, though, in terms of how Indigenous peoples can use technology, on their own terms. And they, as Rukka gave examples, they want to do that, and they are doing that. And in the pandemic, groups have done that, say in Brazil, using satellite imaging for monitoring deforestation, and actually having fact-based evidence that is counter to the disinformation that's used to justify activities in their lands. Technology is a tool that Indigenous peoples need to be able to use. And maybe this comes back to one of the questions: how can the international community help? Well, if they support Indigenous peoples to have access to that type of technology that they can then use to protect their rights, because their governments are not doing that, they're not really interested in doing that. So there's one very kind of concrete example. But it's also very important to bear in mind that consultation processes, even when they happen in person, are so subject to manipulation and abuse and distortion. When you do that online, it becomes even easier to do that, right? So there's multiple layers to this question of moving, online for consultations, and it plays into the simplification of consultation as just a procedure, rather than consultation and consent as something that's grounded on realization and respect for rights.
Thanks very much, Cathal. We have just 10 minutes left and we need to finish on time. So what I wanted to do was call on Louise Nakagawa to ask her question, which I would like to ask all of the respondents to, so that will be your final response, and then I will wrap up the session. So Louise, if you're there, would you like to put your question, as I think it's a good
thank you, Allison. Thank you to all. This is a really inspirational meeting. I mean, it's my brain is almost exploding here, because I think that all of the people around the world would listen to the things that you were pointing out. This is extremely important. And my question is, I think that most of people know about this. However, my question is, what are we missing? Why is so difficult to bring the indigenous people or the rural settlers to really be part of the arena that is making the decision? Why we cannot go forward and really give a space to those people to be part of the decisions that are being made? Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. A challenging question. So, any volunteers to go first, or shall I pick somebody?
I can go first.
Tanja, yes,
if that's okay. I'll try to be brief. I think, that it boils down to, why is participation viewed as so dangerous? Because it's disruptive to existing power dynamics and the existing wealth distribution mechanisms. That's like the underlying thing. And how to address that, that's a very global systemic issue, and there is no silver bullet. I think one of the things we all highlighted just a minute ago was the necessity of legally binding mechanisms that work on both ends, on producer and on consumer side. Everybody needs to work together to achieve this, but the issues are, beyond the law. These are systemic and structural issues that are at play here, and endangering the existing ways that our economic systems work.
Thank you, Tanja. Rukka, would you like to go next?
What was the question again?
I
didn't hear clearly.
Okay, let me repeat.
Training here, sorry, again.
Okay. So the question in brief was that the problem is well recognized, but nothing is changing. So participation isn't happening. So what are we missing to really bring about the change?
You want me to be really honest?
Yes.
I want to give up on government and private companies. Yeah, it is the citizen, it is the people who needs to control them, to let them really get on their feet. So I think we need to start now with again, I remember this like 20 years ago, we used this strategy. We lobby the citizen in Europe to tell their company that they don't want to buy, all these boycotts and everything. I think we need to go back to that, citizen to citizens. From the, again, well, I don't like to call it global north-south, but probably we need to go back to all those old strategy, because we believe in engagement with government. We've tried in Aman, in Indonesia, we've tried since 2007, apparently doesn't work. They trick us all down all the time. So, I said, you want me to be honest? To be honest, I don't believe all this legally binding even now, because they always find their way to get away with this. What we need is to educate the people in Europe to be responsible to themselves, also to us indigenous peoples, to all of us, because in the end of the day, the loser is all of us. and the winner is the very few elites, the companies. That's from my side. And one more, the other day, just a few days ago, in line to this, we heard my great colleague in Ford Foundation telling us that there will be more funding available for indigenous peoples in COP26. And I said to them, actually, those who need the money is the investors, the companies. Give them all the money for indigenous peoples, give them all to pull out their bulldozer from our territories and leave us alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukka. I will turn next to Ketty.
Comparto plenamente.
I fully agree with what Rukka has said. We, as Indigenous people, we feel frustration when we see that we're not being taken into account, our rights are not respected. For us to be taken into account in these spaces and for us to participate in these legal processes in our countries, the main problem is discrimination. And the pandemic has shed light on this structural discrimination towards our people. And we always say that we need to decolonize ourselves in order to understand the other part, to see Indigenous peoples as human beings who also have rights, to see us as something else other than an exotic being. We are human beings with rights that are equal to those of those people who don't see themselves as Indigenous. This is part of a colonial legacy, the discrimination, and that is why we're not taken into account, and to them, it's not important for us to participate, and our suggestions are ignored. Because of this discrimination, over the last presidential elections, the votes casted by Indigenous people, they wanted to revoke this, because in a supposedly democratic country, our vote is valid. However, they tried to ignore our votes. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ketty. I'm going to turn next to Cathal and then give the final word to Ines. So Cathal.
I think the others have touched on the various kind of elements of what I was also thinking, but I suppose just taking the challenge to get recognition for a principle like consent, which is basically saying that somebody can't do something to you without your permission if it's going to have a big impact on your rights. Just the challenge to have that recognition alone has been enormous because of I think the interests, the economic interests that are at stake. And as Ketty said, the underlying fact that there's a legacy of discrimination that's deeply embedded in society, and its perception of Indigenous peoples as, we don't use the term anymore, but historically as backwards or groups who were uncivilized. And I think that there's a real lack of maybe openness among the political class, or to see Indigenous peoples as equals who should benefit just as much as anybody else and have the right to do that. Until we kind of transition to that understanding, there's always going to be huge resistance. But we are in a time of immense change, I think, where people are joining the dots a little bit more. We're far removed geographically, but that's changing with technology, and the technology discussion came up earlier. But as the dots are joined more, and as we see the connections with major issues like climate change and biodiversity and inequality, then I think Indigenous people's issues can really come to the fore, and we can, understand that there's a lot to learn, and we have to sort of realize that there's a lot to learn together. We can address the world's challenges, but I'm not sure what it takes to get us to that point where the power structures start to crumble a little bit, and then new ways of thinking and engaging can happen. But yeah, discrimination, power, rigidity in the system, failure to see others as, you know, equals and meriting exactly the same as everybody else. You know, these are all things that we have to work on and as a collective.
Okay, thank you, Cathal. And Ines, the final thoughts from you.
I really agree with everything that has been said so far. I would say that one of the main things to do, first and foremost, is for Indigenous people themselves to know their rights. They need to know their rights, and they need to assume responsibility and enforce their rights. Only at that point will they be able to take their seat around the table. If they do not know their rights, if they're not accountable, then it is difficult for them to move forward, and it will be difficult for them to be seen as equals to discuss questions that relate to them. We must recognize today that we have made some progress. For example, there is a law that was adopted in 2011 on Indigenous people, and this law was adopted to give Indigenous people's rights, the same rights as the rest of the population, and they can claim their rights. However, one of the issues that we have had in the Congo is that there have been problems implementing this law and enforcing it because we didn't have any implementing texts. But with these texts, we can do it. Of course, it is difficult with It is difficult to take part in decision-making processes because for so many years, these Indigenous people were marginalized. For so many years, they were seen as below others. But today, I think that the trend is changing. The trend is improving their condition. It is important that they impose themselves internationally. It is important for them to be involved in the decision-making processes so that they are heard. Because we need to recognize also that we need to educate them. They need to know their rights. They need to claim their rights, but to claim their rights, they must have the necessary training and education to do so. And I think that today we see many Indigenous people who are becoming leaders, and many of them intervene, get involved, participate in international level meetings. And I think that this process will improve, and gradually we will manage this change.
Okay, thank you very much, Ines. I was going to wrap up, but I don't think I will. I think it is best to leave you with the powerful statements that we have just heard from our panelists. Excuse me. So a few final comments from me. So I would like firstly to thank all of our speakers in this final panel. It's been a really interesting session. Excuse me. Thank you all to the audience, to everyone for listening. And of course, a big thank you to the team that's been working behind the scenes. And in particular, thank you to the interpreters who've been working very hard. And of course, huge thanks to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government for their support for this meeting. The recordings of this session and all of the other sessions will be made available online. We will let you know when they are available, and we'll also be producing a summary of the key points when they come out. So that is all for today and for this global forum. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.